Welcome to the Revenge Diaries. I'm Kendall, 22, a recent graduate working in financial risk analysis. In a cold, incense-filled room at a seaside mansion in Newport, I'm handed a crushing debt until the final page of my grandfather's will changes everything. The ancestral altar room of the Newport estate felt like a gilded cage suffocating under the heavy, cloying scent of sandalwood incense. Rain lashed against the tall windows, but the storm inside was far more treacherous. Attorney Gillian Thorne sat stiffly, his weathered hands resting on a 10-page document that held the weight of a crumbling empire. Gillian didn't waste a second. With a jagged smile that never reached her eyes, she slammed a legal folder onto the mahogany table in front of me. "Sign it, Kendall," she hissed, her voice dripping with artificial concern. The document was an assumption of debt agreement. It demanded I renounce every cent of my inheritance and legally shoulder the $15 million in bond debt Preston had accrued to save his failing firms. "You've always claimed to love this family," Gillian continued, circling me like a shark. "Now is the time to prove it. Save your father's legacy or leave this house with nothing but the clothes on your back." I looked down at the 10-page will, then back at the woman who had spent years trying to erase my existence. Instead of the tears she expected, a cold, sharp smile spread across my face, a look that made Gillian's confidence flicker for the first time. The game hadn't even begun, and she already thought she'd won. Have you ever been manipulated by the people meant to protect you? Subscribe now to witness how the tables turn when greed meets its match. 5 years ago, the salt-cracked air of Newport didn't feel like a threat. It felt like home until the day Gillian crossed the threshold. She arrived not with a storm, but with a calculated whisper draped in silk and a facade of maternal warmth that my father Preston swallowed whole. Within months, the vibrant halls of our family estate began to feel narrow, as if the very walls were leaning in to eavesdrop on my growing unease. Gillian was a master of the subtle art of isolation, planting tiny seeds of doubt in my father's mind about my loyalty to the family firm, all while smiling sweetly at me over the breakfast table. I was the heir apparent, the daughter who had spent her life preparing to protect the legacy Silas had built, but Gillian saw me only as a hurdle to be cleared. The trap was sprung on a Tuesday evening when the sky was the color of a bruised plum. I was summoned to Preston's private study, a room usually filled with the comforting scent of old leather and expensive bourbon. That night, it felt like a courtroom. Gillian stood by the window, her silhouette sharp and predatory, while my father sat behind his desk with a look of devastated fury I had never seen before. Without a word, he spun his laptop around. On the screen were fabricated email chains supposedly sent from my private server to our primary competitors, detailing our proprietary bidding strategies for the Hudson project. Each message was time-stamped perfectly, accompanied by grainy security footage, showing a figure in my coat entering the server room late at night. "I didn't do this, Dad," I whispered, the air leaving my lungs. "These are forged. Someone hacked my account." "The logs don't lie, Kendall," Preston roared, slamming his fist onto the mahogany surface so hard the crystal decanter rattled. "Gillian warned me you were unhappy with the new leadership structure, but I never imagined you would sell us out. You didn't just betray the company, you betrayed your blood." Gillian stepped forward, her hand resting heavily on his shoulder in a mocking show of support. "Preston, honey, maybe she just needs professional help. We can settle this quietly if she just signs a confession." Her audacity was the spark that turned my shock into cold, hard clarity. She wanted me to admit to a crime I hadn't committed so she could strip me of my standing once and for all. When I refused to play her game, the last shred of my father's patience snapped. He didn't want the truth. He wanted the easy explanation she had served him on a silver platter. The confrontation spilled out into the grand foyer as the wind began to howl against the stone exterior. Preston grabbed my pre-packed suitcases already prepared by Gillian's loyal staff and dragged them toward the massive oak doors. The lightning fractured the sky, illuminating the sheer hatred in his eyes. He threw the heavy bags out into the mud and gravel of the driveway, the rain immediately drenching the expensive leather. "You are no longer a part of this house or this business," he shouted over the thunder, his voice shaking with a terrifying finality. "From this moment on, you are a stranger to me. Don't ever use the family name again. You are dead to this family, Kendall. Now get out." The heavy door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the torrential downpour. I stood alone in the dark, the freezing rain soaking through my clothes, watching the lights of the only home I had ever known flicker and disappear. While the world believed the Sterling dynasty was crumbling along with my banishment, a far more intricate game was being played within the shadows of the Newport estate. Silas, the patriarch who had built our empire from nothing but grit and vision, began to withdraw. To the prying eyes of Preston and Gillian, he was a man fading into the fog of old age, a lion losing his teeth. He started forgetting names, misplacing his spectacles, and staring blankly at the ocean for hours. It was a masterful performance. Under the guise of senility, Silas became an invisible observer, a ghost haunting his own hallways, listening to the echoing greed that now defined his home. He watched from his leather armchair as Preston, driven by a desperate need to impress his new wife, began to siphon funds into high-risk ghost resort projects in Florida. Silas heard the hushed, frantic late-night phone calls where his son negotiated backroom deals to cover mounting losses. More devastatingly, he witnessed Gillian's true colors. No longer the doting daughter-in-law, she treated the estate like a personal treasury, charging exorbitant diamonds and couture to corporate accounts, while whispering poison into Preston's ear about how Silas was becoming a liability. They thought they were outsmarting a dying man. In reality, they were providing Silas with every piece of evidence he needed to destroy them. Behind the locked door of his library during the late hours when the house grew quiet, the fog of dementia vanished. Silas's eyes regained their predatory sharpness as he worked via encrypted channels with attorney Gillian Thorne in New York. He knew that if he left the assets in the family name, Preston's creditors and Gillian's vanity would strip them bare before I could ever return. Thus, the concept of K-legacy was born, a silent, impenetrable legal fortress. Silas began the grueling process of liquidating liquid assets and rerouting them through offshore trusts, effectively buying back his own company's debt under this anonymous entity. Every time Preston bragged about a new loan or Gillian flaunted a new necklace, Silas simply nodded with a vacant smile, all while Gillian Thorne was finalizing the paperwork that designated me, Kendall, as the sole irrevocable successor of K-legacy. He wasn't just saving money, he was orchestrating a grand correction of justice. Silas knew my strength, and he knew that my exile in New York was the fire I needed to forge my own path before he handed me the keys to the kingdom. He recorded the embezzlement, documented the fraud, and compiled a ledger of betrayals that would eventually serve as their legal death warrant. The most difficult part for Silas was the forced silence, the necessity of letting his granddaughter suffer in a city far away, while he played the part of a helpless fool. Yet he understood that for the trap to work, the prey had to feel entirely unchallenged. He allowed Gillian to take over the household management, watched her replace loyal staff with her own sycophants, and endured the indignity of being spoken to like a child. Each insult was a pebble on the scale of his resolve. As the months turned into years, the web was spun. Preston and Gillian believed they were standing on top of the world, unaware that the very floor beneath them was now owned by the girl they had thrown out into the rain. The sterile white corridors of the Newport Memorial Hospital felt more like a high-security prison than a place of healing. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long, sickly shadows that stretched toward the heavy mahogany doors of the private wing. I stood at the far end of the hallway, my heart hammering against my ribs, watching the two burly security guards stationed outside my grandfather's suite. Gillian had used her legal guardianship to turn the hospital into her personal fortress, citing Silas's fragile mental state as a reason to bar the very granddaughter he had raised. The air here was thick with the scent of antiseptic and the suffocating pressure of her control. A frail hand suddenly caught my elbow, pulling me into the shadows of a recessed alcove near the service elevator. I gasped, turning to find Martha, the estate's oldest housekeeper, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and resolve. She had served the Sterlings for 40 years, a silent witness to every triumph and every betrayal. Without a word, she pressed a cold, heavy object into my palm and folded my fingers over it. He knew they would try to isolate him, Kendall. Martha whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the ventilation system. The night before the stroke, he told me to watch for you. He said the music has stopped, but the truth remains in the heart of the wood. I opened my hand to find a tarnished silver key intricately carved with the family crest. My breath hitched. I knew exactly where it belonged. It was the key to the internal compartment of the 1890 Steinway piano in the Newport library, a place where Silas kept his most private journals. Martha disappeared back into the darkness before I could thank her, leaving me with the first tangible weapon in a war I was finally ready to fight. I turned the corner, my boots clicking sharply against the polished linoleum, making no effort to hide my presence. Gillian was standing by the nurse's station, draped in a charcoal cashmere coat, looking every bit the grieving wife. When she saw me, her mask of sorrow fractured, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged fury that made the nurses nearby recoil. She stepped into my path, her perfume clashing violently with the medicinal air. "I thought I made myself clear, Kendall," she said, her voice a low, dangerous hiss. "You are a disruption to his recovery. One more step and I'll have you escorted out in handcuffs. You have no rights here." I stopped just inches from her, feeling the cold weight of the silver key burning in my pocket. I didn't look at the guards. I looked directly into her predatory eyes, seeing the flicker of uncertainty behind her arrogant facade. She thought she had won because she held the keys to the room, but she didn't realize I now held the keys to the kingdom Silas had built in secret. "You can pay for all the security in Rhode Island, Gillian," I replied, my voice calm and carrying a weight that seemed to chill the hallway. "You can hide behind your lawyers and your guardianship papers, but you're making a fundamental mistake. You've spent so much time locking me out of this room that you've forgotten to look at what's already behind you. You can't lock away the truth when it's already sitting right under your nose, waiting for the right moment to burn your world down." I leaned in closer, watching her pupils dilate. "Enjoy your temporary throne. The silence in that room isn't his weakness. It's your countdown." Without waiting for her retort, I turned on my heel and walked away. I didn't need to see my grandfather today. I had something far more powerful. As I reached the exit, the storm outside seemed to subside, replaced by a clarity as sharp as the silver in my pocket. The K legacy wasn't just a name anymore. It was a destiny, and for the first time in 5 years, the hunt had truly begun. The air in the grand library of the Newport estate was thick with attention so sharp it felt combustible. Heavy velvet curtains muffled the sound of the Atlantic waves crashing against the cliffs outside, leaving the room in an unnatural, suffocating silence. Preston sat in the front row, his chest puffed out with a forced arrogance, while Gillian leaned back beside him, her fingers idly stroking a diamond tennis bracelet that I knew Silas had never authorized. They looked like victors waiting for a coronation, their eyes flickering with a predatory gleam as attorney Julian Thorne adjusted his spectacles and cleared his throat. I sat in the shadows at the back, the silver key a cold, grounding weight in my palm, watching the architects of my ruin prepare for what they thought was their final payout. As instructed by the late Silas Sterling, Julian began, his voice echoing with a clinical coldness. "I shall read his final will and testament in its entirety. This document consists of exactly 10 pages. He began to read, but the words that flowed from his lips were not the standard legal jargon of asset distribution. Instead, the first page was a meticulous chronological log of corporate malfeasance. Silas had not been drifting in the fog of dementia. He had been a silent bookkeeper of betrayal. The second page detailed the specific bank accounts in the Cayman Islands where Preston had funneled nearly $7 million from the family's primary construction fund. By the fourth page, the room's atmosphere had shifted from anticipation to a chilling dread. Gillian read out a list of unauthorized luxury purchases, Gillian's couture, her secret real estate holdings in Florida, and the kickbacks she had received from fraudulent vendors, all documented with receipts, dates, and wire transfer confirmations. Preston's face turned a sickly shade of gray, the sweat beginning to bead on his forehead, despite the air-conditioned chill. Gillian's hand froze on her bracelet, her composure fracturing as the 8-page indictment stripped away their carefully constructed masks. It was a verbal execution. Silas had laid out every lie, every theft, and every act of disloyalty with the surgical precision of a man who knew he was being cheated and chose to wait for the perfect moment to strike from beyond the grave. "This is absurd!" Preston suddenly erupted, leaping to his feet with a desperate, shaky laugh that sounded more like a rattle. He looked around the room, seeking support from the shocked witnesses. "My father was incompetent. He was senile and delusional when he wrote this trash. These aren't instructions. They are the ramblings of a man who lost his mind. No court in Rhode Island will uphold an 8-page rant as a legal will. It's worthless paper." He turned to Gillian, seeking validation, and she managed a tight, trembling smirk. They believed they had found the loophole. If Silas was insane, the indictment was just fiction, and the estate would default back to the next of kin him. Preston wiped his brow, his confidence returning in a surge of manic denial. "Go ahead, Gillian. Read the rest of your little story. It doesn't change the fact that as the sole heir, I control this house." Gillian Thorne didn't flinch. He didn't even look up from the mahogany podium. He simply reached out, and with a slow, deliberate motion turned the 8th page over. The sound of the paper sliding against the wood was like the sharpening of a blade. "That concludes the evidentiary section of the document." Gillian stated, his eyes finally lifting to lock onto Preston's with a terrifying neutrality. "We shall now move to page 9, the transfer of ownership and debt obligations." The room went deathly quiet. The triumphant smile on Preston's face didn't just fade, it vanished into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror as Gillian began to read the first sentence of the 9th page. The silence following Gillian Thorne's declaration was so absolute, it felt heavy, a physical pressure that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. Preston remained frozen, his mouth half open as if the air had turned to lead in his throat. Beside him, Gillian had subconsciously reached for a crystal glass of vintage Bordeaux from the side table, her knuckles white as she gripped the stem. The lawyer's voice remained steady, rhythmic, and utterly devastating as he moved his finger down to the final paragraph of page 10. "As of 6 months ago." Gillian continued, his gaze briefly flicking to the back of the room where I sat. "All outstanding bond debts, mortgage liens, and corporate liabilities held by Preston Sterling have been consolidated and purchased in full by an independent entity known as K Legacy Holdings. Furthermore, the deed to this Newport estate, along with all ancestral properties in Rhode Island, was transferred into the same trust following the documented breach of fiduciary duty by the current residents." The room seemed to tilt. Gillian's hand began to tremble violently. "Purchased," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry parchment. "With what money the company accounts are drained. Silas didn't have the liquidity." Gillian Thorne offered a thin, mirthless smile, the kind a predator gives just before the final strike. "On the contrary, Mrs. Sterling, Silas was acutely aware of the millions being diverted from the construction funds over the last 5 years. Instead of reporting the theft immediately and risking the family reputation, he allowed the embezzlement to continue, but he intercepted the flow. He utilized a private investigation firm to track every dollar Preston stole and redirected those same funds into K Legacy. In essence, Preston, you bought your own ruin. You provided the very capital Silas used to seize control of your life. A sharp crystalline shatter echoed through the library. The glass of red wine had slipped from Gillian's nerveless fingers, splashing across her white designer rug like a grisly bloodstain. She didn't even look down. Her eyes were fixed on the document in Julian's hands, wide with the terrifying realization that their 5-year plan had been nothing more than a sandbox Silas allowed them to play in until he was ready to wipe it clean. And who? Preston choked out his voice, barely a wheeze. Who is the beneficial owner of this K Legacy? Who is the ghost behind the curtain? I stood up then, the movement slow and deliberate. The silver key from the piano was still tucked in my palm, a symbol of the truth that had finally surfaced. Julian Thorne turned the final page, his expression softening only slightly as he looked at me. The sole irrevocable successor director and owner of K Legacy Holdings, as designated by Silas Sterling's signature and verified by the New York Bar Association, is his granddaughter, Kendall Sterling. The name hung in the air, a final judgment that stripped the finery from the monsters in the front row. Preston collapsed back into his chair, his face a mask of ashen defeat, while Gillian's composed facade disintegrated into a frantic, ugly panic. They were no longer the masters of the house. They were trespassers in a kingdom that now belonged to the girl they had once cast out into a storm. Silas hadn't just saved the legacy, he had handed me the sword to protect it. The debt was no longer a burden on my shoulders. It was a chain I now held, and at the other end of that chain were the two people who had thought I was nothing. I walked forward, my footsteps steady on the hardwood floor, meeting Gillian's terrified gaze with a clarity that silenced the room. The game was over, and for the first time in 5 years I was home. The first light of dawn crept through the tall arched windows of the Newport altar room, casting long, pale streaks across the mahogany floor. The sandalwood incense from the night before had long since faded, replaced by the sharp, cold scent of the Atlantic morning. I stood by the altar, looking not at the symbols of the past, but at the two broken figures huddled in the shadows of the room. Preston looked aged by decades. In a single night, his shoulders slumped and his eyes vacant. Beside him, Gillian was a frantic mess, her designer clothes wrinkled, and her face stained with the remnants of her smeared makeup. The power they had wielded like a blunt instrument just hours ago had evaporated with the rising sun. Julian Thorne stepped forward, placing 2 identical leather-bound folders on the table. The sound of the folders hitting the wood was the only noise in the heavy silence. I didn't wait for them to speak. My voice, when I finally broke the quiet, was devoid of anger. It was the voice of a judge delivering a final, irrevocable sentence. You have exactly 10 minutes to make a choice that will determine the rest of your lives. I said, my gaze moving from my father to the woman who had helped him destroy our family. In front of you is a full voluntary confession of financial fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. If you sign it, you walk out of that front gate right now with nothing but the clothes you are wearing. No money, no jewelry, no names. You will be ghosts. Gillian's head snapped up, her eyes flashing with a last desperate spark of venom. You can't do this, Kendall. This is our home. You're heartless. I stepped closer, the morning light illuminating the absolute lack of sympathy on my face. This was never your home, Gillian. It was a vault you tried to rob. And as for being heartless, I learned from the best. If you refuse to sign, Attorney Thorne has a direct line to the district attorney's office. The evidence from the 10-page will is already digitized and ready for filing. You won't be walking out of here. You'll be carried out in handcuffs to spend the next 20 years in a federal cell. Choose. Preston's hand shook as he reached for the silver pen. He didn't even look at me. The man who had once thrown my life into the rain was now reduced to a trembling coward signing away his dignity to avoid a cage. Gillian followed a moment later, her movements jerky and filled with a silent, impotent rage. They signed their names, and with those few strokes of ink, the last link between us was severed forever. "It's done," Julian whispered, retrieving the folders. I turned my back on them, looking out at the Newport cliffs. "Get them out of my sight, and call the expulsion service. I want every trace of their presence removed from this estate by noon." The walk to the front door was the longest of my life. I watched from the grand portico as two security guards escorted Preston and Gillian down the long gravel driveway. They didn't have a car, a suitcase, or a plan. They were just two shadows walking away into a world that no longer cared who they were. The heavy oak doors, the same ones that had slammed shut behind me 5 years ago, remained open this time, letting in the fresh, salt-tinged air Silas had taught me that a legacy isn't built on bricks or bank accounts. It is built on the silent, unbreakable strength of one's character. Money can buy a throne, but it can never purchase the loyalty that was lost through betrayal. As I watched the gates close behind them, I felt the weight of the silver key in my pocket one last time before I set it on the hallway table. I wasn't just the owner of K Legacy, I was finally the master of my own soul. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clarity that only the truth can provide. The Sterling name would survive, but the rot was finally gone. I took a deep breath, turned toward the library, and began the first day of my new life.